Welcome, good evening. I'm Clyde Scholes, the director of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library. I'd like to welcome all of you this evening to the spring opening of Authors, series that I think has been extremely popular over the last 22, 23 years. Presented by the Blade newspaper and the library. This is an amazing crowd this evening. Thank you for coming. I think that we are so proud to bring so many different authors from very different genres to our library, bringing important voices and conversations into our community. And that they are so enthusiastically received by all of you over the last many, many years, as exemplified by yet another sold-out event this evening.
Our guest tonight, Anita Hill, became a household name in 1991 when she single-handedly advanced the cause of workplace equality. She's the author of Reimaging Equality and Speaking Truth to Power, and she's also professor of social policy, law, and women's studies at Brandeis University. She continues to be an advocate today for equality and civil rights, and she's raised awareness nationwide on issues of sexual harassment. Because of her efforts, Congress has passed a law that has allowed sexual harassment victims to seek damage awards as well as back pay and reinstatement. As a social commentator, Professor Hill's views have been published in Time Magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Miss Magazine, and many other publications. She's appeared on a number of television shows, including Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Tavis Smiley Show, Meet the Press, and Larry King Live. Last April, HBO Films released a great movie, and if you haven't seen it, I urge you to watch. It's called Confirmation. It's featuring a big name television person in Kerry Washington who plays Anita Hill. And there's a star-studded backup crew on that film, but it looks at what happened. It looks at the important behind-the-curtain Washington politics that were depicted in the explosive 1991 Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, when Ms. Hill accused him of sexual harassment. The hearings brought the country to a standstill. I remember it to that day. I was an editor in Florida, and I was riveted by the coverage. And it became a pivotal moment in American culture, forever changing how we perceive and experience workplace equality and gender politics. Although Judge Thomas was ultimately confirmed to sit on the High Court by a very slim margin, Ms. Hill's allegation of sexual harassment cast a spotlight on gender equality in the workplace in a manner that truly is groundbreaking. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you a true change agent in gender equality, Anita Hill.
Boy, thank you, Mr. Frank, for that generous introduction. Thank all of you for coming to hear what I hope will be inspiring words that give you hope and promise and can help us think about the future. You know, we come to the libraries for various reasons. Some come to move their lives forward through the information they gather here. Some come to be inspired and move to places where they can only be when they're reading and in books. Some come for comfort, and you know, some just come because it's a great place to be and feel. And I'm just happy to be here tonight because I can't think of a better place to be looking out at this audience. So thank you for having me. You know, it is, I understand that some of you saw the documentary on Monday night. So thank you for coming. Thanks for screening the documentary. And as many of you know from the introduction, there's an HBO movie. They're both about the hearings, both take particular looks at the hearings. The HBO movie looks at what happened in that moment. And the documentary really attempts to move us forward. And that's one of the things that I want us to do tonight, is I want us to think about that moment 25 years ago. There I was, me in my green suit, and I still think that for most of you who you've not seen me, you said you were watching and riveted in that moment, and I think some people still expect that I'm going to walk in the room and I'm going to have that green suit on, and I'm not going to have any gray hair, but I've moved on 25 years. So this is me today, and I'm still trying to explain. Not trying to explain my testimony or the relevance, really, of my testimony, sometimes, some bit of that, but really I'm trying to explain to people who I see something very basic, that women and men are entitled to work and be educated in places free of sexual harassment. That's pretty basic, and we're still working for it. But it's all more than just that we're entitled to it, that equality demands that women's lives and work be valued the same as men's. Now, that's pretty basic too, but it's still something that we're struggling to persuade. So where are we today? Now, tonight, I could regale you with stories about Thomas's behavior. I could name some names about senators who were misbehaving, behaving very badly, and I'll do a little bit of that later. But you've probably seen a bit of it yourselves if you've seen the movies. Today, we are in a new day. And the talk that I may have given 6 months ago is not necessarily the talk that I would give today, because this is a different moment. And I want us to think about the hearings of 1991, but not just sort of as this static thing in time, but as something that can teach us how we are to move forward in this day, from this moment. Now, I will say that I consider this talk to be a combination. This is a month, I know the city of Toledo is working through a number of organizations on women's empowerment. And I've heard about different groups that have been formed, and I think that's absolutely spectacular. And it is Women's History Month, so people get, oh, it's Anita Hill, Women's History Month. She was history. It makes perfect sense, right? But I also want you to think of this as kind of a twofer, because we have just finished Black History Month. And though most people probably, when they think of me, they think of the testimony, they think about women's empowerment. But let me just remind you that from the beginning of the Clarence Thomas hearing, the issue of race was front and center. And for me, obviously, they are always interests that are converging. They can't be separated. But just let me tell you a little bit about how I see race in the Thomas hearings. And it's not simply because an African-American man was nominated to be the second African-American on the Supreme Court. I'm known for testifying about sexual harassment, but at stake in 1991, throughout the hearings, throughout Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearing, including my testimony, but not limited to my testimony, were equality principles that Justice Marshall had espoused. And Justice Marshall, Thurgood Marshall, of course you know, was the man that Clarence Thomas was going to replace. So this was a hard-fought battle. Justice Marshall had moved from being an attorney to being a Supreme Court justice, and throughout he had fought to develop and extend rights and protections in the courts, and particularly starting with people, with African-American people. These ideals include protections against, though, both race and sex discrimination. When Justice Marshall spoke and wrote as a Supreme Court justice, he wrote in cases helping to define what was sex discrimination, sometimes in dissent, but always on the side of individuals' rights, expanding individuals' rights and protections. And I've read some of his sex discrimination cases, and if you haven't done that, I think you'll understand what a contribution he was making. For him, it was clear that if these principles that were protecting race discrimination were going to hold up, they were also going to have to be expanded to include protection for all marginalized groups. And he wrote that, and he was committed to that. Eliminating, you can't get rid of racism without eliminating sexism and a lot of other biases that continue to exist. The principles that Marshall articulated as a judge extend to a range of equality issues. So racism and sexism, to me, are inextricably linked to each other and other forms of bias that plague us. Now, when I say it wasn't just the trading of one African-American body for another, that wasn't what the idea of race was entirely about. It was actually a trading of one ideology, one way of thinking about race and rights. So Clarence Thomas was an individual who had actually acknowledged publicly that he believed that it was time for the government to step aside in terms of the protections of race. All of those protections that Justice Marshall had fought for that were growing and expanding, and today cover things like same-sex marriage and the bathroom bills that are coming out of North Carolina and Texas. Justice Thomas, or Judge Thomas, had said, we need to shrink, essentially, the protections. So these were protections that had been fought for on the backs of African Americans. And so this was really a change in the way the government was going to look at its role. And Clarence Thomas was going to be the new face of race, not just a new member of the Supreme Court. So we need to think not only about what happened in terms of gender in those hearings, but we need to also think about what they said about race and how the two really converge to create a sense of what equality is going to look like from 1991 and to this day. And how, if the notion of shrinking rights had taken hold, we may not really be looking now at states that have legalized same-sex marriage. We wouldn't be looking at expansion of rights in terms of protecting women on campuses against sexual harassment and sexual assault. We may not even be looking at the cases that the Justice Department has started to go in and investigate police departments and looking at what is going on in police departments where unarmed individuals are being killed by police. So I just wanted to give that little background, and I want you to think that, we're going to hear a combination race and gender talk that is also going to try to include a lot of the issues that we're facing today as we think about a universal concept of equality that extends through a whole lot of categories of individuals. So for me, the hearings marked a moment in our collective social, political, and legal histories. It has implications for how we conceive and imagine equality today and perhaps well into the future on a broad range of issues. Now, Donald Trump's election in November began a new political era, and his nomination of Neil Gorsuch is unfolding in ways that suggest that how he's going to rule and what his impact on legal issues might be. Through Trump and Gorsuch's combined prominence and in combination with a Jeff Sessions Justice Department, yes. Okay, I promise it's going to get better before the end of it. It's not going to sound so great. We should expect, but we have to begin to expect significant changes, because that is the reality of where we are now. Significant changes to our future political, social, and legal landscape. So tonight I'm going to try to connect 1991 to this new day, to Trump and his Justice Department, to the Supreme Court, and to our own political engagement as litigants, as scholars, as informed citizens in general, as people who will be voting, who will be resisting, and who will be acting in their own communities and states and nationally. So let me draw a little bit upon the hearings. I see the 1991 hearings as a 20th century morality play with a 21st century significance, okay? So let's start with some background about sexual harassment. And I'm going to talk about sexual harassment. I'm going to start from that point of view, but really, you know, as we go forward, I'm hoping we can start to see where we're building on the concept, because that's just kind of the beginning. But in 1976, the Red Book magazine poll found that 9 out of 10 women had been subjected to unwanted sexual advances at work. That was a 1976 poll. So that's where we were, 15 years prior to the hearings. The laws protecting against sexual harassment had been in place since the 1970s, but in the 1980s, some judges still viewed sexual extortion and verbal abuse as personal, not legal matters. And so cases that were brought were dismissed. In the 1990s, the EEOC, the federal agency in charge of enforcing workforce anti-discrimination rules, had only begun to develop the guidelines. And despite a ruling in favor of students' claims for protections under Title IX in a case in 1980 that articulated what those protections were, the Education Department offered very little guidance for colleges and universities on how to process campus sexual harassment complaints. Now, a little more context, and this is something that people may not be aware of. There was a poll, there was a whole series of studies that was done on the judiciary, state to state, in the 1980s and into the 1990s. In the 1990s, they were closed out. But in 1991, within a few months of the hearing, Marina Angel, this law professor, had done an analysis of some of the information that was coming out of these surveys about what it was like, race and gender in the court system. And what they found out that from people in the legal profession was that judges themselves were often harassers. In fact, lawyers reported witnessing judges solicit sexual favors from women who came before the courts, including criminal defendants, civil litigants, lawyers, prosecutors, public defenders, private counsel, law clerks, law students, court employees, job applicants, probation officers, juvenile court wards, and jurors. And that was the state of our case. So, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to you that some judges thought that these were just personal issues and not something that was a matter of violation of law. I'm sure many of them didn't even think that they were violating the law. But there were some courts that actually acknowledged these claims in the 80s, and there were a handful of successful cases that were put forward. But for the most part, workers and students were left on their own to try to navigate the abuses that they encountered. And you look back on that and you say, well, no wonder people did come forward. If they didn't think they'd have any chance of winning, and if they didn't be protection against retaliation, of course you're not going to come forward in that atmosphere. And it's against this backdrop that the Senate Judiciary Committee subpoenaed me. And the subpoena itself made very clear, it called upon me to testify about sexual harassment that I experienced. When I had written my statement to the Senate, I had barely described what had happened. They put a label on it. But then putting a label on it, what they also did was to raise the bar to me to prove a legal claim. Now, that was sort of the beginning of kind of the end, because this was not a court of law. They didn't have any rules. They didn't have any procedures. They didn't even really want to do the hearings. And so I was asked to come before the body that wasn't really suited to determine whether or not sexual harassment existed. I was given about less than a week to prepare, and they were given less than a week to investigate. And as all of you know, any of you who've, I know I have a couple of civil rights lawyers here tonight, any of you who have practiced the law know, whether it's in civil rights or anything else, that you need more than a week to investigate your complaint. You need more than a week to prepare for a hearing. I gave my testimony as evidence of Judge Thomas's character. the people get a little bit confused. They say, well, weren't you raising a sexual harassment complaint? Well, no, that's not what you do before a Senate Judiciary Committee, and you can understand why. They weren't prepared to do that. What I was testifying was his character and fitness for a lifetime appointment in our country's highest court. That, to me, was what was at stake. The integrity of the court itself was at issue. And for me, his appointment was not a right that he had earned. It was a privilege that he had to earn. So I knew once that he was confirmed, he was going to have to sit in judgment of sexual harassment claim. It wasn't just a matter of my personal civil rights. It was a matter of equality and justice under the law for everyone. Clarence Thomas had proven himself to be a man who thought he was above the law. And anyone who believes that they are personally above the law, to me, is questionable, at the very least, in terms of their ability to do justice and to judge everyone equally. If you believe some people are above the law, including yourself, then you're going to have a hard time being fair in judging complaints. So that was the basis of my testimony. So instead of a hearing, the Senate really didn't want, they wanted a swift rush to a vote. Now, I said I was going to connect 1991 to today. So think about this. They didn't do an investigation. So they bypassed doing a proper investigation. What they did, and that wasn't the only thing they bypassed, they bypassed expert witnesses who had volunteered to testify. They refused to call expert witnesses to give testimony. So they themselves weren't informed in terms of their questions, and the public wasn't informed to help them understand the problem of sexual harassment. They bypassed, and this one I have to attribute to Senator Biden, 3 witnesses who had experience, who had given statements, sworn statements that they had experienced the same kind of behavior. They just went all around all of that because they wanted to vote. They wanted a conclusion. Many of them just wanted to win. They didn't care about governing. They didn't care about informing the public. And so what they lacked in terms of information, they substituted with myth. So there was this huge vacuum of knowledge that they refused to understand, and they put in their own myths and thinking about it. And there are many examples of that, but there are some that you just have to call out. So Senator Danforth attributed my testimony to what he pulled out of some psychiatry book, erotomania. Now, he got somebody to say erotomania, somebody who was supposed to be credentialed as a psychiatrist to say the word erotomania. And then he went and did a press conference and said that maybe I was suffering from erotomania. I hadn't seen the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist hadn't seen me. And really, if you read, I didn't even know what erotomania was at the time, but if you read the definition of erotomania, it doesn't even fit. But it was sort of a technical enough, and it was basically saying, when women claim sexual harassment, they're just, a little crazy. There's just something wrong with them mentally. Instead of those 9 out of those 9, he would say those 9 women out in the Ed Book survey, he would say, oh, there's just something wrong with all of them, must have erotomania. The 9 out of 10 women in the workplace. Senator Orrin Hatch, you remember Orrin Hatch? Orrin Hatch waived a copy of The Exorcist. And so I suppose he was suggesting that it's hard to know because this is just it's so nonsensical that I suppose he was suggesting that sort of I was demonically possessed. And Simpson, and this was probably the most dangerous. Simpson, instead of sort of diagnosing me at this point, he said, well, if an individual is a harasser, a person who does that, engages in that, he would have to be some kind of animal. Now, again, instead of acknowledging a reality that they were experiencing themselves in the Senate. And you remember, not long after that Bob Packwood story broke, that they had witnessed sexual harassment themselves, that people who they called, my esteemed colleague, were behaving at it. He sort of portrayed all harassers as people who were animals instead of people who we regularly promote and put in charge of other people, which we will see over and over again to be the case. So that was what I like to call their alternative facts. Alternative reality that they just sort of substituted and promoted to the American public as reality. Now, are you beginning to see some connections? Because this is now, in the form of that hearing, when that vote was taken, what happened was that policy, that was a policy choice to confirm Clarence Thomas. Policy was being guided by myth and misinformation and deliberate disinformation. So the gavel fell, Thomas was confirmed, and seemingly, in terms of the issue of sexual harassment, nothing had happened. Except that behind the scenes, in the day-to-day reality of life, something was happening. Some of it was not so good. In terms of my friends and supporters and family, many of them were being threatened. I was being threatened. Some lost their jobs for supporting me. Some were threatened to lose their jobs, but stayed on and resisted. And that too is a lesson, really, in the reality of what it is like to come forward. Now, I said something else happened. Let me go on. And then, because there were pundits who said that my story was too unique to resonate. They were painting sexual harassment as rare and only a problem of what they considered me to be, an ambitious young professional woman. They tried to make it a class issue. They tried to conflate it and say, oh, well, it's only a gender issue, but it's not a race issue because he's an African American and she's an African American. Not looking at how my race colored the perception of my testimony. The pundits tried to subtly suggest that sexual, and not so subtly in some cases, that sexual harassment wasn't a real problem and that women should just they should keep quiet because they said no woman is ever going to come forward after 1991 and witnessing the Senate Judiciary Committee. They thought women and some men, we would just go away quietly. But that's not what happened. In 1991, many people acted. They began to act. They began to move forward to make sure that their own voices could be heard and that the voices of others could be heard as well. And that is really, for me, the true story. Now, Senator Simpson, I'll bring back one more finger pointing. For Senator Simpson, but this is all based in fact, he's on tape, threatened me with real harassment for coming forward. and called sexual harassment complaints crap. And that was the state that we found ourselves in 1991. So some of you have already told me, I met you tonight, you said you watched the hearings in real time. You watched the hearings. And did it feel at that moment as though things were entirely grim? I think it did. I think we were shocked. And if you look back now, now I can look back with a better, clearer vision than I could at the time. Many of us were shocked that this could happen. Many of us were, some people say, well, I can't believe that they voted to confirm him after this. I can't believe that they excluded those other women after hearing what they had to say. But it didn't end that way. Working women mobilized their rights, and complaints to the EEOC and in the courts soared. Employers responded as well. Employees instituted on their own or with the cooperation of employers policies and procedures where none had existed before. There was a lot of work because there was a lot of work that needed to be done. We needed to step up. We talked, Mr. Frank talked about the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1991. That was a law that had been in Congress, in committee, for years. And President Bush said that if it was put before him, he wouldn't sign it. In fact, after the hearings in 1991, the public sentiment was such that the laws not only passed in the House and Senate, but President Bush signed it into law. We moved. Instead of shrinking back, we started to imagine what our lives would be if we didn't have to confront sexual harassment. How much closer could we move to equality if we could be free of these abuses in the workplace? And it didn't begin or end, and for that matter, with sexual harassment. And not simply in the workplace. There was work that was being done on college campuses. And thanks of late to a whole host of brave advocates of young women and men on college campuses, the issue of campus sexual assault has finally reached public consciousness in ways that it deserves. We know, in fact, that there is no bright line between sexual harassment and sexual assault. That in some cases, both are prevalent. That in fact, one very often leads to another. And so today, we refuse to see them as just life or just something that you have to put up in many cases. Simply because the problems are so pervasive. Just because they're pervasive, it doesn't mean that we have to put up with them or that they are normal. So we have begun in 1991, and we continue through these years to reimagine equality. And we've had some successes in courts with schools being held responsible for peer harassment. Male on male harassment is now actionable, along with numerous individual claims. Colleges and universities have been held accountable for fraternities and teams that engage in group harassment. And schools like Harvard, where teams have been held accountable, have been suspended. Fraternities have been suspended from schools for the kind of harassment that now has become online and virtual, but is just as dangerous. The EEOC and the Department of Education have also stepped up. And this summer, the EEOC convened a task force that provided real concrete evidence of harassment, harm harassment, causes workers. This has taken a long time. That group just convened this past summer. So the big deal about that development is that in the room, when this was all being recognized, were not only advocates in harassment and consultants, but also business representatives. So we're moving in the right direction. This is all breakthrough. And it's not just about sexual harassment. It was never even about sexual harassment in 1991. I remember I was sitting in my office right after the hearings, and I got a phone call from someone, and I was getting lots of calls at the time, and many of them were not nice. But I got this call, and I picked up the phone, and this man on the other end of the phone said to me, "You've opened a whole can of worms." And I didn't know what the next sentence was going to be. I didn't know if there was somebody who was going to curse me because he didn't want to be exposed, or whether it was going to be somebody who was sympathetic. And it turned out that it was an individual who had been a victim of incest. And what he said was, "You've opened a can of worms." Because when I saw the hearings, this man said, I saw not just the senators, but I saw the way my family reacted when I told them that a relative had abused me. So this effort that we have made, where people are coming forward, where they're telling their stories, is not just about sexual harassment. I've had women who have been victims of domestic violence come forward. I've had women and men who have faced discrimination come forward to me and tell me that they had the courage to tell their stories after 1991. I've actually had individuals who have said to me, "I never really understood, even though I've been in civil rights, I never really understood how my mother or my wife or my sister had experienced civil rights, how they had experienced inequality, until we had a conversation after the hearings." So we moved forward together, and we ignored many of the differences in our situations, in our stories. We ignored the fact that people were trying to make this a class problem or pigeonhole it into something and limit it. I say try to minimize it so that you wouldn't have to look at what a systemic problem it was. And we've moved beyond that to work on this issue of sexual harassment, sexual assault, incest in some cases, domestic violence and others, to get people to open up and use their voices. And even to me, the stories that people have shared to me, how they have shared stories of their own experiences, to me that is powerful. That's not to be looked at as something that's just, oh well, they shared their stories. For years, I was talking to a woman in line today who talked about telling her daughter about sexual harassment. And we both shared, she's younger than I am, but we both shared the fact that our mothers never could tell us about this problem. So we now are at a different place than we were. But we also have sexual assault deniers in high places. Okay? And we have them in the public too. You know, it took an awful long time for the public to fathom that Bill Cosby might be a possibly drug and assault women. It took a long time to get there. It took a long time for Roger Ailes to be revealed for who he is, and Bill O'Reilly. And Bill O'Reilly is still on the television, insulting Maxine Waters and insulting all of us by doing that. Roger Ailes supposedly lost his job, but I understand he was given a $40 million severance pay. This, after clear evidence that his company found that he had sexually harassed and maybe even assaulted women. And we have people who excuse their own sexually predatory language, that they are entitled to grab people, women, without their permission, touch them without their permission. They're entitled to do that because they're famous and wealthy. Now, we must never, never, ever accept sexual harassment, assault. It's something that men do. They just do that. Like mansplaining. We don't, or man spacing, or leaving the toilet seat up. Sexual harassment and assault is illegal, it's predatory, and it ought to be eliminated. It shouldn't be excused away no matter who is doing it or who does it or who thinks they're entitled to do it. And people who think they're entitled to do it ought to be held accountable for their own words. And I'm just going to be specific here, and specifically about our president-elect. The president-elect is not only the president, he's not the president-elect anymore, okay, I've moved forward. I've moved out of that phase. I got to the president-elect phase, now he's the president. But he is also the commander-in-chief. We have a problem with sexual harassment and assault in the military. And our brave men and women in the services deserve a commander-in-chief who will renounce his own statements and promise to protect and spare from harm those people who dedicate their lives to protecting this country, no matter what the harm is. So, where are we now with the court? I'm just going to say a few things about Judge Gorsuch, because Judge Gorsuch is really a well-trained lawyer. He has a particular judicial philosophy that is conservative. There are many people who are conservative. But Judge Gorsuch has a very unique concept of what his originalist philosophy is. In particular, he would limit severely the rights of federal agencies to write regulations and rules protecting individual rights. And his thinking actually has been said to be even more restrictive than Justice Scalia's was. And the Supreme Court recently rejected an interpretation that he had given on a disabilities case. And disabilities is one area in particular where both he and Jeff Sessions have pushed back on the legal protection. We know that Jeff Sessions, for example, can have an impact, as the Attorney General, can have an impact on cases. Jeff Sessions was the individual who has now been arguing on behalf of the immigration policies now that are banning immigration to this country and travel. Jeff Sessions also withdrew an Obama administration interpretation of Title IX that would protect Gavin Graham, who is the young man, transgender man, who is seeking to be able to go use the bathroom that he chooses to use in his school. He's fighting against restrictions that the school have placed on him. The restrictions were interpreted very differently by the Obama administration. And so Graham thought that he was going to have a case going to the Supreme Court with the backing of a Justice Department he no longer has that and has going to go back now and have to litigate this matter all over. And some of you are thinking the bathroom cases are limited, but let me give you 2 reasons why it's not. We've had bathroom restrictions before in this country. And I don't think I ever really understood it as clearly as I did when I had a young student who, a transgender student who was coming to Brandeis to school. And she told me that at every stop she had to think about where she was going to be able to go to the bathroom. And it reminded me of my mother talking about traveling into the Deep South to visit family and thinking about what opportunities that she was going to have, thinking about how she had to decide what she was going to eat, when she was going to eat, because she didn't know when she was going to be able to find a facility. So we've had this restriction before, and the common thing is that the majority gets to tell individuals what their identity is and what it means in terms of the limits that will be placed on their lives. So let's not think about these bathroom bills as just sort of bathroom bills. They're restrictions, really, on our ability to self-identify in ways that really are troubling. But they're also this interpretation of Title IX that is being offered, that Title IX doesn't really include gender in the way that it's being interpreted, has been interpreted, is truly dangerous for any woman and man a woman, for example, who is told that if you wear more makeup or if you act more feminine, we will promote you. And that has happened historically, and the regulations under the Title VII has been interpreted to protect that woman. Now, if we start pushing back on the extension or the definition of gender and coverage of Title IX, it's going to go over into Title VII, and we could really undermine a whole 3 or 4 decades of cases that have been protecting women in the workplace. So let's think about that when we think about not only Gavin Graham, but the importance of having a Justice Department that will stand up in the Supreme Court for the protection of individual rights. There's one case that I want to talk about. And it's a case because it's personal in many ways to me. And it's a Title IX protections case of a little girl named LaShonda Davis. And LaShonda Davis was a 5th grader who had been physically assaulted by a classmate. And this was a real physical assault. This was not just teasing. This was a young man, 12-year-old boy, actually, who pinned her against the locker, who put something hard in his pants and threatened to sexually assault her, who was so egregious, behavior was so egregious that the local district attorney brought charges against him. And he pleaded no contest to the charges with his parents. So it was worked out through the criminal system. Nevertheless, the school did nothing to protect her, refused to protect her, refused to even allow her to move her seat from sitting beside this boy. So she and her parents sued. And they went to the Supreme Court and they won their suit. 5-4 decision, though. And this is where it starts to get troubling. 5-4 decision with Justice O'Connor writing the majority, writing for the majority, writing the opinion. Justice Scalia, Thomas, Alito, and Kennedy were in dissent. And I've never heard such caustic language in this decision, in dissent. And this is the dissent I'm going to focus on. Kennedy warned of federal intrusion into a day-to-day classroom logistics and interactions. That was what he was concerned about. Federal intrusion into day-to-day logistics and interaction. Day-to-day interactions is where discrimination happens. If you can't intrude that, you're never going to end discrimination. It's not just some abstract principle. It's real what's happening on people's lives. So he also painted the court's decision as an overreaction to behaviors that were routine problems of adolescence. Now, he had the facts before him. Again, this attempt to normalize this behavior as just routine adolescent behavior. I don't know what kind of school he went to, but that is not routine adolescent behavior, and even if it is, it needed to stop. Further, Justice Kennedy saw the case, and this is where it really is about his judicial philosophy, and this is where I think Gorsuch and he could come together if a case like this is brought. Little is said, this is a case that teaches little Johnny a perverse lesson in federalism. Again, the abstractions and not the day-to-day life. And Justice O'Connor rejoined by saying that, no, in fact, this is a case that assures that little Mary may attend class. Right? Let's hear it for Justice O'Connor. But Justice O'Connor is not on the court. She was the swing vote then. Justice Kennedy now is positioned to become the swing vote. Justice Gorsuch, who is said to be more conservative than Scalia. So what happens if LaShonda Davis comes before the court today? Well, I'm hoping that justice will prevail. I don't believe that she will have the Justice Department on her side, unfortunately. I'm not even sure that she will have the Education Department on her side. But she will have us. She will have those of us who are engaged. She will, in fact, have a whole host of amicus briefs from schools who may have at one point resisted Title IX, from schools, from individual lawyers, from individual, even family members perhaps, who have had their rights adjudicated and have won them. Those are the kinds of activism that are continuing and are starting to move, to sort of integrate into the law that the Supreme Court has decided, gets to decide. All is not lost, but all will be lost if we step back, if we really believe the stories, the alternative facts, the false narratives about, oh, we're all too different to come together. If we believe that, and we aren't as active and engaged, then we will lose. I don't believe that we're there. I've seen too many, and it's beyond just the millions of people who were in the streets who came and marched during the inaugural. I've seen really an awakening and an ability to push forward on these issues, even when our federal government may not. And they may not, and they likely will not, help us to move forward with equality. But that's where we come in. And we are so much stronger than we were even in 1991, 25 years ago. We have our stories. We have our truth. We have the case law on our side. We have new legal weapons in court. It's not going to be easy. We have new social science research that supports not only the fact and existence of bias, but also supports the fact of the value that comes from inclusion. And that is where we are today. And we can all play a part in how we move forward. It is all of our duties to protect, really, the rights that everyone has to live as free and equal. So we can do this. I've seen what happened in 1991 when everyone said that no one would come forward. We came forward in record numbers. When they tried to shame us and keep us quiet, we spoke up. Some will say we persisted. And we will continue to persist. So here I am, 25 years later. I never thought that this was going to be what I would be talking about. I never thought that the problems would be so entrenched. But I was just really kidding myself. We're dealing with problems that have been supported by systems, that have been paid for, and have occurred over centuries of time. They're not going to be ended overnight. But they can be confronted, they can be controlled, and we can all play a part in it. I'm just going to close with this. There are a couple of things I want to close with. And one is sort of a funny story. It's from a fifth grader that I got a letter from. And she said, this was a student who was actually, yeah, it was a fifth grader. But she said that her teacher, that was a seventh grader. She said that her teacher had required them to look at the hearings, and then they had to write letters about it. First of all, they voted. So she said, we took votes about who we think would win, and it seemed Clarence Thomas won. The score, she says, was 30-19. She said, it seems he won. Yeah, it does seem he won. She says, I voted for you and wish you had won, but you didn't. Nevertheless, she figured it out, and she said, I think it's unfair because most judges are men, and they usually pick the men to win. But she was also philosophical. She says, well, I'm sorry you didn't win, but life has to go on. And life does have to go on, but it doesn't have to go on and be the same. And I'm a living witness to that. It does go on, but it can also be greatly improved. And by speaking out, I believe that my life has been greatly improved. The last story I will tell you is another quick story, and it's about me, because I know some of you are thinking, oh, well, that's easy for you to say that you could make change because you can go out and you get to speak to all of us, and it's wonderful, and your life must be charmed. Well, I will tell you a story about, in my own institution, I was asked on weekend after commencement to go to a meeting at 8 o'clock the next day. For any of you who are in the academy know how commencement week is just awful, and you're tired at the end of it, and you don't want to go to a meeting the day after commencement at 8 a.m. So I went to this meeting, and I was there, not late, 5 minutes to 8 is not late. And I pulled into a parking lot, and I got into the first parking space I saw. Well, it was the executive parking lot, and I wasn't an executive. After being in the meeting for about 5 hours and really going through a lot of material, I was asked to be there, and I did present, and I think I added value to the meeting. I came out, and a young woman from the president's office said to me, Anita, did you move the cone out of that parking space? And parking an executive lot to get to that space. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, we put a cone there because just in case somebody important might come and they need a place to park and they're coming to see the president. And that didn't help. That explanation did not help me. I said to her, and this was my most reserved thing I could say at that point, I do not move cones. Then I was not quite satisfied. I was still a little perturbed, even after saying that. So I gave myself a timeout, and I went home. And I thought about it for a while, which is what timeouts are supposed to do, right? You all have children, right? And I said, you know what? I do move cones. That's exactly what I do. And I'm happy to move cones to get to be at the places where I need to be to do the things that I need to do. And I also like to think that I move cones for other people so that they can do what they need to do. They can be all of that they need to be. They can be accepted in places and be heard. It's not always thanked. People don't always appreciate it. It's not always glamorous. What we do to advance equality is not always glamorous. It's not always well appreciated, but it is necessary, and it is what we can do. So I invite you today to join me being a cone mover, whether the cones are large or small, whether people thank you or not, when you know it is the right thing to do. I invite you to, wherever it is, for you to be a part of our movement forward. And I will just end with a quote. Even though this was not what I expected to be doing 25 years later, I realize, in the words, to paraphrase the words of Shirley Chisholm, I was, am, and will always be a catalyst for change. And I enjoy it, and I imagine equality and reimagine it every day, and I hope that I can reimagine it with you as we all act for change that will move us to a much, much better place than we are today. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And I sometimes think it's remarkable that you happen to be a lawyer in that particular situation. And it brings a lot of insight into it. So you sort of knew what you were getting into. But I wonder, do you, or can you, as a lawyer, follow the work of Judge Thomas and give me sort of an analysis in the most objective way you can?
Well, I often get, do you follow Judge Thomas? I don't do it because I know I'm not objective. But unlike some people, I admit that I'm not objective. I will say is that it is clear that he has a very different attitude and ideology than Justice Marshall. And I think that it's come through in some cases that are particularly disturbing. And perhaps most disturbing is the voting rights case, saying that we no longer need to have preclearance of these voting rights restrictions that have been prevalent throughout our history. And so now what we've seen is that that states like Texas and North Carolina and probably many others that are coming up are pushing those forward. And that not only ties to the Supreme Court, but now also the Justice Department. Because if there is no preclearance, even if there was preclearance, but if there is no preclearance, then what is going to happen is the Justice Department is going to have to sue. And the chances of a Jeff Sessions Justice Department suing for enforcement of voting rights is, questionable. We know that Jeff Sessions has a history, according to Coretta Scott King, of active voter suppression himself. If you believe the words of Coretta Scott King, and she had no reason to write anything different. So I think that's a long way of saying, I'm not going to answer your question by Clarence Thomas. But it's good information, right? But it gives us something to think about, what is going on. We are now at a time where the courts matter, the Justice Department matters, and one person's vote, including Clarence Thomas, could change the trajectory of the case law.
I have a 19-year-old daughter who is just finishing up her first year at the Maxwell School, studying public policy. And one of her big groups that she's been involved in lately is something called Free the Nipple Are you familiar with that?
No, don't know that one.
It's part of their organization is pushing to pass the ERA right now, but it's a civil rights, gender equality, human equality sort of thing. But obviously, by the name, it's very much in your face. And they have T-shirts that go.
Young people are in your face.
And I was
teach them.
just curious what you thought of.
Well,
organizations
I
like
think that we've got. It's interesting. The protests this weekend in Russia involved a lot of young people. That was not expected. Our protest here, although people think that young people are apathetic, I work on a campus and I can see them as anything but. I think what we are seeing now, and they're going to pull all of us together on this, I hope, is a much broader sense of what equality is. And I think it's very healthy, really, for them to be pushing us in directions that those of us who are used to defining it and imagining it in sort of limited ways, we need to know this. We need to hear these ideas to figure out how we can integrate those into our understanding of what we need to begin to do to move us to that next step. So I don't know that plan in particular, but I know that they have different ways of thinking about equality, and it is much more basic. It is much more about our lived experiences than abstract ideas and abstract protections. And I do believe that it's where we need to be. I also hope that they are going to be more politically engaged. I haven't seen that quite happen in the ways that I think it will need to happen. But I do think that they need to be much more involved in getting engaged in elected politics and really thinking about candidacies and thinking about getting themselves elected. So, good luck to you and your daughter.
Hi, good evening. After seeing the HBO film, I thought one of the most interesting insights was the suppression of witnesses condoned by Senator Biden. And I was just curious if you have any existing dialogue with him today, or if actually was the film even accurate to that point, or was it, obviously HBO, things are sometimes
fictional
a little dramatic,
adaptations.
so how much of the film is accurate?
Well, in the film, there was only one witness. There were, in fact, in reality, 3. They made a composite of one witness into one, which in and of itself to me is, I wouldn't have done that. Because we know that these numbers matter. We also know that we don't all experience the same behavior in the same way. And so I would have liked them to, it was absolutely accurate. I'm not going to dance around your question about Biden. Yeah. So, no, I haven't talked to him. I have not spoken with Joe Biden at all. I know that, in fact, Joe Biden has done some things to combat violence against women, and that's valuable and valued. But I think in that moment, he showed a lack of leadership in the way that the hearings were conducted. He has said that it was my choice not to have those witnesses. That is absolutely not true. It was not my choice or my team's choice. We did not control the witness list. So it was his leadership. And we haven't talked about it. I'm sure we could have a conversation about it, but he hasn't reached out to me.
Hi.
Hello.
This last election, when I think about it, and I think about the behavior of the candidates, especially the one who won, and the stuff that came out of his mouth regarding women, Hispanics, veterans, I question the direction of this country because people voted, and yet none of that bothered them. And it kind of made me feel that the United States has a moral decline that's starting from the top, and that the people at the bottom don't think there's nothing wrong with that kind of behavior, that they overlook it.
Yeah. Well, I think you could have been able to add it on mocking disabilities, xenophobia, homophobia, religious bias, any number of things that were articulated, and I don't know how to explain it. I really don't. One of the things that I say is that I refuse to believe that everybody who voted for him really believes that those things are appropriate. I think perhaps we are at a point where we have really engaged from what happens to other people. We think our differences are more important than our common values. And that's, to me, a dangerous place to be. Because what we should be realizing is that we all belong here. And we all deserve representation that respects who we are and respects those differences and values them. I don't know how to get there. And then I suspect there were probably people who just weren't paying attention. It was surprising when this was all in everybody's face, how they weren't paying attention, or they were just willing to just excuse, well, he doesn't really mean that. But even the fact that people would say it to me. But here's another thing, though. I think those of us who live it, who experience it, because of our gender, because of our whatever part of our identity, do get a clearer picture of how some people who don't experience marginalization just don't even see it. And where do we learn? Where do we teach? Where do we start getting people to understand and feel and empathize? It's really troubling because we are told that a new generation of people don't see those differences. But I'm not quite so sure that that's the case. It may be the case during high school and college, but then we start to divide again and segregate in workplaces. And I see that harassment now is just as high a level as it was 20 years ago, when even though the workplace is now populated by much younger men, many of whom have been raised by women who've been in the workplace, and they still behave this way. So we're dealing with institutions and structures that reinforce the differences and use those differences as a way to advance some people and not others. And I think it sort of came out in the election. But I think we've learned. I think just in that short time we've learned. And I also think that we should be comforted by the fact that the president did not win a majority vote. But perhaps the biggest lesson is that we all better get out and vote. We all better get out, and we better find somebody who didn't vote to get out and vote in the next election. If you think the way that I think, if you're concerned about what's going on, you better get out and vote. So that's that thing that Barack Obama has instituted. It's on us now. It's on us. I'm not blaming us for this, but it is on us to change it.
One last.
Ms. Hill, thank you so very much today. And as a much younger professional woman at the time of your hearings, I do want to express thanks not only for myself, but obviously for my daughters as well. And those of us who were there and working at those times really understand how brave it was of you to do what you did at that time and at that place. And my question goes to your state of mind at that time, in the sense that you had a core group of people that supported you, your family, your friends. But as you looked out among the women, working women at that time, did you have an idea of how many of us, perhaps the majority of us, could sympathize with you in your position, or did you feel somewhat isolated in the group and of supporters that you had? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I had a group of supporters, you're right, and they were wonderful. But I also had the forces of the Senate trying to isolate me, to say that my situation was just unique and odd, and sort of put me in a category of myself. So I did, in fact, wonder, is what's going on? Because this was not something that I had studied or had any real information about. There were experts out there, but it wasn't an area that I had studied to know that there were other women and how many other women there were. I started getting letters, though. And the first one came in the middle of the hearing, and that really did save me, because it was just knowing that there was one person who was feeling what I felt. And then a week or so after the hearings, there was an ad taken out in the New York Times. It was by a group of women, African American, in defense of ourselves. And African American women in defense of ourselves, who took out this full-page ad for $50,000 in the New York Times. And they collected the money within a matter of hours. And they talked about the history of sexual violence and abuse of African American women. So that gave me another perspective that helped me to understand that this was part of something that had been happening for years. I didn't know until afterwards, then, when I started getting floods of letters, how many women there were out there. And then when women started stepping forward and filing complaints, because some of the pundits actually said to me, well, women are not going to come forward now, and it's your fault. But when women did start coming forward, and so all of this it took a while. In the meantime, I had already decided that I was going to go out and start talking, because I started to hear from people, and I knew that there were people who were trying to understand, and women who were still trying to be heard. And so that became my mindset. It was not at that point just trying to explain my situation, because for years when I was talking about sexual harassment, I never would talk about my situation. Because I didn't want people to think, oh, she's just talking about her case, she's just trying to retry her case, because I knew the problem was bigger. So this has all been an evolution to get to this point. And I just don't want any other woman to ever feel that they are alone in this. I don't want any other victim of any kind of abuse to ever feel that they are alone in this. I always say, I had the best of many possible worlds, because I was a lawyer. I was not only a lawyer, but I was a teacher. I had, in fact, experienced this kind of hostility before in many forms, and many of you have. I had a wonderful family. I had great friends. The people talk about my lawyers, they were all law professors too. They didn't have any except for Charles Ogletree, any litigators. Many of them were just law professors, but I had great friends and supporters. That is never promised to anybody when you step forward. You're not gonna, not every victim's gonna have friends, family, supporters, but what we can give them is fair processes. We ought to be able, as a society, to give them that. We can't give them back family support. We can't give them friends that support them. We can't give them an understanding of the law and how these experiences fit within a whole history of abuse. But we can give people fair investigations, fair processes for filing complaints. We can give them procedures that don't privilege the value of their male abusers over them. And then in the end, if we find that there are violations of our rules, policies, or laws, we can punish offenders. And that's what we owe people. That's what we can give people. That's the way we can move forward. And so we're not there yet. But we can. We can be. If we work together. Thank you. Good night.